I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
There is something peculiarly English about the determination to be festive in the depths of winter. On that bitter December evening, as my motor car crunched through the snow-covered drive of Thornfield Hall, I reflected that nowhere is this national characteristic more evident than at a Christmas ball. The great house rose before me like a beacon against the Yorkshire darkness, every window ablaze with golden light, the sound of music and laughter spilling out into the frosty air despite the thick stone walls that had weathered 3 centuries of northern winters. I had accepted Lady Margaret Thornfield's invitation somewhat reluctantly, for I am not naturally given to such social gatherings. However, my old friend Colonel Bradshaw had been most insistent, declaring that a man cannot spend every winter evening by his own fireside reading crime novels when he might be witnessing the intricate dramas of real society. Besides, Hastings, he had said with that knowing smile of his, Lady Margaret's Christmas balls are legendary. Half of Yorkshire society will be there, and where you find such a concentration of wealth and ambition, you invariably find the most fascinating human specimens. How prophetic those words would prove to be. I had attempted to persuade my friend Hercule Poirot to accompany me, but he had declined with characteristic firmness. "Mon ami," he had said, adjusting his perfectly symmetrical moustache. "Poirot does not venture into the English countryside in December to watch the upper classes consume too much champagne and speak too loudly about their neighbors. The little grey cells, they require warmth and comfort to function properly, not drafty ballrooms and muddy boots." He had waved me away with an affectionate gesture. "Go, enjoy yourself, but do not expect Poirot to rescue you from the boredom of polite conversation." Little did either of us suspect that before the evening was through, I would be desperately wishing for his presence. Thornfield Hall presented a magnificent spectacle that night. The ancient ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with garlands of holly and ivy wound around the marble columns, and great boughs of mistletoe suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the polished floor where couples moved in elegant formation to the strains of a small orchestra. The air was perfumed with the scent of pine and beeswax candles, underlaid with the more worldly aromas of expensive cigars and French perfume. Our hostess, Lady Margaret Thornfield, a handsome woman of perhaps 50 with silver hair and keen blue eyes, moved through her guests with practiced grace. She had inherited the estate from her late husband, along with his considerable industrial interests, and was known throughout the county for both her charitable works and her shrewd business sense. Tonight she wore deep blue velvet that complemented her coloring, and at her throat sparkled the famous Thornfield diamonds, a necklace that had been in the family since the reign of George III. The guests represented a carefully curated selection of Yorkshire's social elite, each invitation no doubt calculated for maximum social and business advantage. I recognized several faces from the newspapers: Sir Reginald Ashworth, the steel magnate, whose ruddy complexion and booming laugh made him impossible to miss; Mrs. Penelope Hartwell, Lady Margaret's widowed sister, elegant in black silk with jet ornaments; Dr. Marcus Thornfield, Lady Margaret's nephew and heir, a serious young man with the pale complexion of one who spends too much time indoors with his medical texts. But it was another figure who commanded the most attention that evening: Sir Alistair Finch, the industrial titan whose financial empire stretched across continents. A man in his early 60s with silver hair and sharp, aristocratic features, he possessed the kind of presence that made conversations pause when he entered a room. Tonight, however, I noticed something different about him: a tension in his bearing, a distraction in his manner that seemed at odds with his usual commanding presence. "Finch looks rather troubled tonight," observed Colonel Bradshaw, following my gaze. "There have been rumors about his business dealings lately. Something about a merger gone wrong, though I can't say I understand the details." Indeed, as the evening progressed, I observed Sir Alistair in several intense conversations with various guests. I saw him speaking earnestly with Dr. Thornfield near the conservatory doors, their voices too low to overhear, but their expressions grave. Later, he was in animated discussion with a younger man I didn't recognize. Someone with the eager, slightly desperate look of a person with financial troubles. Most notably, I witnessed a brief but clearly heated exchange with Lady Margaret herself, conducted in hushed tones near the refreshment table. Whatever passed between them left our hostess pale and Sir Alister's jaw set in a hard line. The evening's festivities reached their crescendo as midnight approached. Lady Margaret had arranged for the traditional ceremony of the mistletoe, with couples gathering beneath the suspended boughs for the customary kisses. The orchestra struck up Auld Lang Syne, and glasses were raised in preparation for the New Year toast. It was then that I noticed Sir Alister's absence from the main ballroom. "Where's Finch got to?" asked Colonel Bradshaw, scanning the crowd. Surely he wouldn't miss the midnight ceremony. A search was organized, though initially it was conducted with more curiosity than concern. Sir Alister was known for his independent nature and occasional need for solitude. Lady Margaret suggested he might have retired to the library, where he often sought refuge from large gatherings. Dr. Thornfield volunteered to check, and several other guests offered to search the various reception rooms. It was young Miss Evelyn Hartwell, Mrs. Penelope Hartwell's daughter, who made the grisly discovery. She had ventured to the library in search of her forgotten gloves when her piercing scream shattered the festive atmosphere. We rushed to find her standing in the doorway, her face white with shock, pointing with a trembling finger toward the leather armchair beside the fireplace. Sir Alister Finch sat slumped in the chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the coffered ceiling. His face had taken on a greyish pallor that spoke unmistakably of death, and there was about his expression something of surprise, as though his final moment had caught him utterly unprepared. Dr. Thornfield immediately took charge, kneeling beside the chair to examine the body with professional competence. His initial assessment was swift and decisive. "He's been dead for at least 30 minutes, he announced grimly. Possibly longer. But as he leaned closer, his expression changed. "There's something else," he said quietly, and I caught the faint but distinctive scent of bitter almonds that clung to the still air around the corpse. "Cyanide," Dr. Thornfield pronounced with certainty. "Someone has poisoned Sir Alister." The transformation of the gathering was immediate and complete. The festive atmosphere evaporated as though it had never existed, replaced by an air of suspicion and barely suppressed panic. Lady Margaret, with admirable presence of mind, ordered that no one should leave the premises until the police arrived. The doors were quietly secured, and the guests found themselves trapped in what had suddenly become the scene of a murder. Inspector Davies of the Yorkshire Police arrived within the hour, a competent but clearly overwhelmed man who found himself facing a crime scene populated by some of the most influential people in the county. As he began his preliminary investigation, it became apparent that this was no ordinary murder case. Every guest had been accounted for during the crucial period, yet someone among them had managed to administer a lethal dose of poison to one of England's most prominent industrialists. The inspector's growing frustration was evident as he struggled with the complexities of the case. The social implications alone were staggering, and his usual methods seemed inadequate for dealing with suspects of such elevated status and apparent respectability. It was Lady Margaret herself who, in a moment of inspiration, born of desperation, suggested summoning London's most celebrated detective. "I have read of Monsieur Hercule Poirot's remarkable successes," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "If anyone can unravel this terrible mystery, surely it is he." And so, as dawn broke over the snow-covered Yorkshire moors, a telegram was dispatched to London, carrying with it a plea that would soon bring the famous Belgian detective to Thornfield Hall, where he would encounter one of his most challenging cases, a murder committed in a room full of witnesses, where everyone had an alibi, and the killer walked among us still, hidden behind the impeccable facade of English respectability. As I stood in that library, looking down at the mortal remains of Sir Alistair Finch, I could not help but think of my friend Poirot's words about the little grey cells requiring warmth and comfort. How wrong he had been about the evening's potential for boredom, and how desperately we would need those little grey cells before this Christmas mystery was solved. The transformation of Thornfield Hall from festive celebration to crime scene was as swift as it was complete. Within minutes of Dr. Thornfield's grim pronouncement, Inspector Davies had taken charge with admirable efficiency. Though his discomfort with the elevated social status of his potential suspects was palpable. The library was sealed, a constable posted at the door, and the remaining guests confined to the drawing room under watchful supervision. I found myself studying the assembled company with newfound intensity, for if my association with Poirot had taught me anything, it was that moments of crisis strip away social pretenses with surgical precision. Lady Margaret maintained her composure with iron discipline, yet I observed the slight tremor in her hands as she instructed the staff to provide refreshments for the increasingly agitated guests. Her sister, Mrs. Penelope Hartwell, presented a study in contrasts, outwardly distraught, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, yet her gaze remained sharp and calculating, missing nothing of the unfolding drama. Young Miss Evelyn sat pale and trembling beside her mother, the shock of her discovery having rendered her nearly speechless. Dr. Marcus Thornfield had positioned himself near the windows, ostensibly available to assist the inspector, but I noticed his attention frequently returned to studying the other guests with clinical detachment. Sir Reginald Ashworth, usually so boisterous and commanding, sat hunched in his chair, his ruddy complexion having taken on an ashen quality that aged him considerably. The young man I'd observed in earnest conversation with Sir Alistair earlier, Mr. James Whitmore, as he had identified himself, paced the room with barely contained agitation, chain-smoking cigarettes and repeatedly demanding to know when they would be permitted to leave. His nervousness was so pronounced that even Inspector Davies had taken special note of his behavior. The inspector's preliminary questioning revealed the maddening complexity of the case. The fluid nature of the evening's social activities meant that nearly everyone had plausible reasons for brief absences from the main ballroom. Visits to the cloakroom, conversations in quieter corners, steps outside for fresh air. The crucial period between 11:30 and midnight, when Sir Alistair had last been seen alive, became a frustrating maze of partial alibis and uncertain timelines. Dr. Thornfield confirmed that he had encountered Sir Alistair in the hallway around 11:30, heading toward the library with what appeared to be a troubled expression. Lady Margaret recalled their earlier heated exchange by the refreshment table, though she remained diplomatically vague about its content. After that, Sir Alistair seemed to have vanished from the collective memory of the party until Miss Evelyn's terrible discovery. As dawn broke over the snow-covered Yorkshire landscape, Inspector Davies's growing frustration became increasingly evident. This was clearly beyond his usual experience of village disputes and petty theft. It was then that Lady Margaret, with characteristic decisiveness, made her suggestion about summoning London's most celebrated detective. I've read extensively of Monsieur Hercule Poirot's remarkable successes, she declared, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to having her suggestions implemented. If anyone can unravel this terrible mystery, surely it is he. The telegram was dispatched immediately, and by mid-morning we received Poirot's characteristically precise reply. Arriving 2:47 train. Preserve all evidence. Allow no departures. The little grey cells are intrigued. H. Poirot. He arrived with his customary punctuality, stepping from the motor car as immaculate as though he had just emerged from his London flat rather than endured a lengthy journey through winter weather. His patent leather shoes showed no trace of snow, his overcoat was perfectly arranged, and his famous moustaches appeared to have been groomed en route. Mon ami Hastings, he murmured as he entered the drawing-room, his eyes already cataloguing every face present. "You see how the English countryside calls to Poirot, even in the depths of winter." He turned to Lady Margaret with a formal bow. "Madame, I offer my deepest sympathies for this tragedy, and you, Inspector Davies, I offer my complete cooperation. You will find me perhaps exacting in my methods. It is my nature." "If being exacting will catch us a murderer," Lady Margaret replied firmly, "then you are welcome to be as exacting as you please." Poirot's first request was to examine the library, not to disturb evidence, but to observe and absorb. He spent long minutes in silent contemplation, his keen eyes noting details that others had overlooked. The angle of the chair, the distance between furniture, even a forgotten sprig of holly on the skirting board. When he emerged, his expression was thoughtful but determined. "Now," he announced to the assembled company, "we shall proceed with method. Each person will tell me precisely where they were when midnight sounded, and what they believed Sir Alister to be doing at that moment. Not the convenient truth, mes amis, but the exact truth. We shall not be long, but we shall be thorough." The investigation had begun in earnest. Poirot established his temporary headquarters in Lady Margaret's morning room, a bright chamber with tall windows overlooking the snow-laden gardens. With characteristic precision, he arranged 2 chairs at precisely the correct angle to catch both natural light and observe facial expressions, positioned a small writing table for his notes, and placed a 3rd chair for Inspector Davies, who watched with growing fascination as the Belgian detective transformed an ordinary room into what he termed a laboratory of human psychology. "We proceed with method," Poirot announced, adjusting his perfectly symmetrical mustaches. "Each person will recount their movements during the crucial period, from 11:30 until the discovery of the body. But more than this, they will reveal to Poirot the psychology that drives their actions. The little grey cells, they observe not merely what is said, but what is felt, what is feared, what is hidden." He summoned Lady Margaret first, not as a suspect, but as the hostess whose authority might encourage honesty in others. She entered with dignity intact, despite the morning's ordeal, settling into the chair with the composure of one accustomed to command. "Madame," Poirot began courteously, "you spoke with Sir Alister near the refreshment table. This conversation, it was heated, no?" Lady Margaret's hands, steady now, folded carefully in her lap. Sir Alister could be rather inflexible in his business views. We disagreed about a charitable endowment connected to his mills. He wished me to transfer control of certain family trusts to his oversight. I declined. Her voice carried the finality of old aristocracy. After that exchange, I did not see him again until poor Evelyn's discovery. And at midnight you were visible to all. I was on the dais, arranging the mistletoe ceremony. The orchestra had begun Auld Lang Syne when someone remarked on Sir Alister's absence. She paused, her keen blue eyes meeting Poirot's steadily. I was in full view of perhaps 50 guests. Poirot made a careful note. "The Thornfield diamonds you wear tonight. They are magnificent. A gift from Sir Alister, perhaps?" A flicker of something unreadable crossed her features. "They are a family heirloom, Monsieur Poirot. They have been in the Thornfield collection since the reign of George III. As Lady Margaret departed, Poirot turned to Inspector Davies with interest. "Observe, mon ami, how she answers the question I did not ask. Most illuminating." Dr. Marcus Thornfield entered next, his pale complexion and serious demeanor unchanged from the previous evening. He possessed the quiet authority of his profession, yet Poirot detected an underlying tension in his bearing. "Doctor," Poirot began, "your medical training allows you to identify cyanide poisoning with remarkable certainty. This suggests considerable experience with such cases." I completed my studies at Edinburgh, where toxicology was extensively covered. The symptoms were unmistakable. The bitter almond odor, the facial expression, the rapidity of death. Cyanide acts within minutes when administered in sufficient quantity. Précisément. And this poison, it could be obtained how? Dr. Thornfield's jaw tightened slightly. With difficulty, one hopes. It has legitimate industrial uses: photography, mining, certain chemical processes. Some medical laboratories maintain small quantities for research. He paused, clearly wrestling with his conscience. I should mention that my own medical supplies include a small amount for laboratory work. It is properly secured, but you wish to be honest with Poirot, which is wise. The detective's tone remained gentle. Now tell me of your encounter with Sir Alistair near the conservatory. The young physician's composure wavered. Sir Alistair was concerned about certain business matters. He had heard rumors about the estate's financial position and wished to discuss them with me as heir apparent. It was not a pleasant conversation. He was threatening, perhaps. Not threatening precisely, but he made it clear that he possessed information that could damage the family's reputation and financial standing. He suggested that certain accommodations might be necessary to prevent such information from becoming public. Poirot absorbed this revelation with apparent calm, though his eyes sharpened perceptibly. And your response? I told him I would need to consult with Lady Margaret before any such accommodations could be considered. He was not pleased. When Dr. Thornfield departed, Poirot summoned the butler, Mr. Fellows, whose testimony proved crucial. The dignified servant confirmed that he had delivered a tray of cordials to the library at Sir Alistair's earlier request. Noyau, Benedictine, and brandy, arranged on a silver salver. I left the tray on the low table beside the armchair at approximately 20 minutes to 12, Fellows reported with professional precision. The fire was lit, but I saw no one. When Miss Evelyn screamed and we rushed to the library, I observed from the doorway that one glass had been used. Which glass? Poirot asked sharply. The Noyau, sir. The small liqueur glass. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Cyanide and bitter almonds. The room had smelled of both. Noyau's natural almond flavor would perfectly mask the poison's taste. Miss Evelyn Hartwell followed, still pale from her terrible discovery. Under Poirot's gentle questioning, she confirmed that she had visited the library earlier in the evening around 9 o'clock to retrieve a book, leaving her gloves behind in her haste to escape an overly persistent dance partner. When she returned near midnight to collect them before departure, she had expected to find the room empty. Sir Alistair was sitting very upright in the chair, she whispered, not slumped as one might expect. His hands were folded formally in his lap, and there was that terrible sweet smell in the air that made me feel dizzy. The pattern was emerging with crystalline clarity. Someone had known of Sir Alistair's intention to seek solitude in the library, had anticipated his request for cordials, and had prepared the Noyau with deadly precision. The killer possessed both opportunity and intimate knowledge of their victim's habits. As Poirot concluded the morning's interviews, he turned to Inspector Davies with characteristic confidence. Mon ami, we have established the method and narrowed the field considerably. The psychology of this crime reveals someone under extreme pressure: financial ruin, family disgrace, or professional destruction. They chose to act during maximum risk because they believed the social chaos would provide perfect cover. He consulted his notebook with meticulous care. Now we must examine the physical evidence more closely and speak with the remaining suspects. The truth? She begins to show herself, but we must be patient. The little grey cells, they require all the facts before they render their verdict. The investigation was gaining momentum, and I could see that familiar gleam in Poirot's eyes that indicated his formidable intellect was closing in on its quarry. By midday, the chill in Thornfield Hall seemed to have seeped into every conversation, despite the rising sun melting the frost upon the terrace panes. Poirot, after a brief pause to review his notes, summoned Mr. James Whitmore for interview. The young man entered, visibly strained, his eyes darting between Poirot, Inspector Davies, and myself. His nervous fingers fumbled with a cigarette case, and I could not help but note the tension radiating from him. "You will be precise, monsieur," Poirot intoned gently, regarding your movements from 11:30 until the alarm. Whitmore's voice quavered. I argued with Sir Alistair earlier, over an investment he'd promised and then withdrawn. Around 11:30, I tried to phone my solicitor from the anteroom, but the line was busy. I returned to the ballroom, but it was stifling, so I stepped out by the conservatory for air. At 11:45, I passed near the library corridor, but didn't go in. I wanted to avoid another confrontation if Sir Alistair was there. Poirot leaned forward. But you were seen near the library? Whitmore flushed. Yes, well, the light was on under the door. I thought perhaps he was inside. I decided against going in. Poirot pressed on. Your quarrel with Sir Alistair, it was about money. The young man's jaw set. He held notes that could ruin me. I've had bad luck in the markets. He enjoyed the power. Poirot made a note, then nodded for the next witness. Mrs. Penelope Hartwell entered, clad in black silk, her composure now more genuine than theatrical. Poirot's tone softened. Madame, your recollections from last night, if you please. She sighed. I was with my sister most of the evening. We parted before midnight. Margaret to the dais, I to help Evelyn escape an overeager officer. I did not speak with Sir Alistair after our earlier greeting. Poirot's gaze settled on her gloved hands, where a faint smear of green was visible at the lace edge. You have been among the holly, perhaps? She managed a brittle smile. I have a habit of plucking leaves when anxious. The house is filled with them. As Mrs. Hartwell departed, Poirot signalled for the butler, Mr. Fellows, to bring the library tray. Fellows, solemn as a priest, carried in the silver tray, on which stood the bottles of brandy, Benedictine, and a squat, frosted bottle of noyeau. Poirot examined the glassware closely, noting a faint opaline sheen on one liqueur glass. He did not touch, but inhaled delicately. Almond, yes, and something else. He looked to Fellows. This bottle, it was a fresh one. Yes, sir. Sir Alistair requested it specifically. I fetched it from the locked cupboard at 20 minutes to 12 and left it, unopened, on the tray, with a cork knife. Poirot's brows furrowed. So the bottle was opened in the library, poured, and perhaps the glass wiped. Sir Alistair was particular, but I cannot say, Fellows replied. A soft knock announced Lucy, a housemaid who entered nervously. Please, sirs, I saw someone go into the library about 11:45. The gentleman with the striped green and yellow scarf. He came out a few minutes later, wiping his hands on a white handkerchief. Inspector Davies's eyes lit up. Whitmore's scarf. He's as good as hanged. Within the hour, Davies returned, producing a small wooden box from Whitmore's valise, photographic chemicals, and a vial labeled KCN potassium cyanide. Summoned again, Whitmore stammered, I use it for plates. Landscapes, I never. Davies interrupted. You had the motive, the means, and you were seen at the door. I am placing you under arrest. Poirot watched the scene with a strange pity. At last he spoke. Inspector, you must do as you see fit. But if Mr. Whitmore is our murderer, he is also a conjurer of genius, for he acts in one way and yet the body tells us another story. No, no, there is order here we have not yet discerned. Davies bristled, but Poirot's attention had already shifted back to the tray, to the single glass, to the faint scent of almonds mingling with something less easily named. As the afternoon waned, Poirot gathered his notes. The evidence, she is too neat, mon ami, he murmured to me. A murder so carefully fashioned must rely on more than mere opportunity. We must look beyond the obvious, to the psychology, the pressure, the knowledge, the subtle manipulation. It is perhaps not who slipped the poison into the glass, but who assured that Sir Alistair would be the one to drink it. With the guests restless and the household tense, the investigation had reached a crucial turning point. The surface was orderly, but beneath The tangled web of motives and opportunities was only beginning to reveal its true pattern, and Poirot, his eyes alight, was ready to follow those threads wherever they might lead. Despite Inspector Davis' visible satisfaction with Whitmore's arrest, the tension at Thornfield Hall seemed to deepen rather than dissipate. The young man's protestations of innocence echoed through the corridors as he was led away, and I observed that several guests appeared more troubled than relieved by this swift resolution. Poirot, meanwhile, stood motionless in the library doorway, his keen eyes fixed upon the scene of the crime with an expression I had learned to recognize. The look of a man whose little gray cells were detecting discordant notes in an apparently harmonious symphony. "Mon ami Hastings," he murmured as the inspector departed with his prisoner. "Observe how convenient this solution appears. A young man in financial distress, carrying the very poison used in the crime, seen at the crucial location. It satisfies the inspector's desire for swift justice, but does it satisfy the demands of truth?" He stepped into the library, his movements precise and deliberate. Consider the psychology, if you will. Would a guilty man carry such damning evidence in his own luggage? Would he wear his distinctive scarf when approaching the scene? None. This is either the work of a complete fool or the careful construction of someone far more clever. With Inspector Davies gone, Poirot was free to conduct his own examination without official interference. He approached Sir Alister's chair with the reverence of a scholar studying an ancient manuscript, noting details that others had overlooked in their haste to accept the obvious solution. "Regardez, mon ami," he said softly, gesturing toward the corpse's positioning. The hands are folded with almost pious precision, the body arranged as though the victim had simply fallen asleep by the fire. But cyanide, she is not a gentle death. There are convulsions, spasms, the body's violent revolt against the poison. This peaceful tableau, no, it has been arranged by careful hands after the fact. He knelt beside the chair, his magnifying glass catching the firelight as he examined the carpet beneath. With delicate precision, he extracted a tiny shard of crystal from near the table leg. Voila. This tells us much. A glass was broken here, or perhaps another glass was brought and removed, leaving this fragment as evidence of the substitution. The killer, he was meticulous, but even the most careful criminal cannot erase every trace. Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Fellows, whom Poirot had summoned to provide a tour of the house's less public areas. The dignified butler led us through a maze of servants' corridors and concealed passages that honeycombed the ancient structure, remnants of an era when the ancient great houses required discreet movement of staff and supplies. "The house, she has many secrets," Poirot observed as we examined a narrow passage that emerged near the library through a door disguised as bookshelves. The mechanism operated silently, recently oiled as part of regular maintenance. Someone familiar with these passages could move unseen during the evening's festivities. "Tell me, Mr. Fellows, who among last night's guests knows the house intimately?" Fellows considered carefully. "Lady Margaret and Mrs. Hartwell grew up here, naturally. Dr. Thornfield spent many childhood holidays at the Hall. Sir Reginald has been a frequent guest for 20 years. Beyond that, most visitors would be unfamiliar with the layout." Returning to the library, Poirot conducted a more thorough examination of the drinks tray. The 3 bottles stood in their original positions, but his sharp eyes detected something that previous investigators had missed. The Noyau bottle, though opened, retained its original seal around the neck, except for a tiny puncture mark, almost invisible unless one knew where to look. "Magnifique," he breathed with satisfaction. The poison was not added to the glass, but injected directly into the bottle through this small hole. A fine needle, perhaps medical in nature. This explains the killer's certainty of success. Sir Alister's known preference for Noyau made him the inevitable victim, regardless of who poured the drink. This discovery was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Sir Reginald Ashworth, whose usual bluster had been replaced by visible agitation. His hands shook as he approached, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Monsieur Poirot, I must speak with you privately. There are things about Sir Alistair, about last night, that you must understand if you are to solve this terrible business." In the privacy of the morning room, Sir Reginald's composure finally cracked completely. "Alistair was not merely a business rival," he confessed, his words tumbling out in a rush of relief and desperation. "He was blackmailing me, has been for months. He discovered certain irregularities in my company's accounts. Nothing criminal, you understand, but embarrassing enough to destroy me socially and financially if made public." Poirot leaned forward with intense interest. And what did he demand in return for his silence? "Control of my steel mills, a merger that would have left me with nothing but a ceremonial title while he absorbed my life's work. Last night was to be my final answer. Accept his terms or face public disgrace." Sir Reginald's jaw set with stubborn pride. "I told him to publish and be damned. I would not be his puppet, regardless of the consequences." This revelation transformed the entire complexion of the case. If Sir Alistair had been systematically blackmailing multiple guests, the list of potential murderers expanded dramatically. Each victim would have possessed both, compelling motive and desperate need for their tormentor's permanent silence. As Sir Reginald departed, visibly relieved by his confession, Poirot turned to me with renewed energy. "Now we begin to see the true architecture of this crime, mon ami. Sir Alistair was not merely murdered. He was executed by someone who could no longer endure his manipulation. But the killer was clever, très clever. They arranged not only his death, but also the perfect scapegoat in poor Monsieur Whitmore." He began pacing the room with characteristic precision, his hands clasped behind his back. "Consider the evidence. The scarf that belongs to Sir Reginald, but implicates Whitmore, the cyanide conveniently discovered in the young man's luggage, the witness who sees a figure of the wrong build entirely. Someone has orchestrated this entire tableau with the skill of a master playwright." The afternoon shadows were lengthening as Poirot prepared for the next phase of his investigation. The surface explanations had been stripped away, like layers of paint from an old canvas, revealing the complex web of blackmail, desperation, and calculated revenge that lay beneath Thornfield Hall's respectable facade. The real murderer walked among us still, confident in their clever misdirection, but they had not reckoned with the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's extraordinary mind. "Tomorrow, mon ami," he said with quiet confidence, "we shall gather all the players for the final act. The little grey cells, they have absorbed much today, and tonight they will arrange the facts in their proper order. The truth, she is patient, but she will not be denied forever." That evening brought no respite from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Thornfield Hall like a shroud. Poirot, declining the offer of dinner in the main dining room, requested a simple meal in the morning room where he could continue his methodical examination of the evidence. The physical clues, he insisted, must be made to speak as clearly as the psychological revelations that were slowly painting a picture of systematic manipulation and desperate revenge. "Mon ami," he said to me as we examined the contents of the cloakroom, "observe how the English gentleman reveals himself through his accessories." He lifted 2 green and yellow striped scarves to the lamplight, holding them side by side with the reverence of a scholar comparing ancient manuscripts. "The club colors, they are identical, but the quality, that tells a different story entirely." The first scarf bore the unmistakable hallmarks of superior craftsmanship. Fine wool, deep saturated colors, and most tellingly, a small monogram worked in gold thread at one end, R.A. The second, while superficially similar, revealed itself as a cheaper imitation under Poirot's scrutiny. The wool coarser, the dyes less permanent, no monogram to mark its ownership. "Sir Reginald's scarf bears his initials," Poirot observed with satisfaction, "while the one discovered in Monsieur Whitmore's luggage is merely a copy. Most illuminating, but we must confirm this with our witness." Lucy, the housemaid who had observed the figure near the library, was summoned once again. Under Poirot's gentle questioning, her memory proved more precise than anyone had realized. "The gentleman with the scarf, mademoiselle. Did you perhaps notice any other details? A pin, perhaps, or some ornament that caught the light?" Her face brightened with the pleasure of being useful. "Oh, yes, sir. There was a little pin on his tie, shaped like a hammer and anvil, all shiny gold. It caught the light from the corridor lamp." Poirot exchanged a meaningful glance with me. The crest of Sir Reginald's steel works, an anvil and hammer, was well known throughout Yorkshire. This testimony placed Sir Reginald, not Whitmore, near the library at the crucial time. Our next investigation took us to Dr. Thornfield's surgery, a pristine chamber that reflected its owner's medical training in every carefully organized detail. The young physician unlocked the room with obvious reluctance, his pale complexion even more drawn than usual. "Your instruments, Doctor," Poirot observed, examining a velvet-lined case of surgical implements. "They are maintained with admirable precision. These hypodermic needles, for instance, they would be capable of very fine work indeed." Dr. Thornfield's jaw tightened. "Any physician requires such equipment, but if you're suggesting I use them for some nefarious purpose—" "I suggest nothing, mon ami. I merely observe." Poirot's eyes lingered on a small gap in the ordered row of needles. "Your inventory? It is complete?" The doctor consulted a leather-bound ledger with meticulous care. "All present and accounted for," he replied, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that had not been there before. As we prepared to leave the surgery, Poirot paused at the wash basin, noting its spotless condition. "You maintain excellent hygiene, Doctor. Most commendable. Tell me, when you identified the cyanide poisoning so quickly last night, was it purely from the symptoms, or did you perhaps detect the characteristic odor?" "The bitter almond scent was quite pronounced," Dr. Thornfield replied carefully. "Though I should mention that not everyone can detect it. The ability is genetic." "Indeed. Most interesting." Poirot made a note in his small book. "And you, naturally, possess this genetic gift?" The doctor's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Poirot caught it. Yes, I believe so." Later that evening, as the household prepared for another restless night, Poirot arranged for private interviews with the remaining suspects. The revelations that emerged painted a picture of Sir Alistair Finch that was far darker than anyone had initially suspected. Lady Margaret, maintaining her dignity despite obvious strain, confirmed what Poirot had already begun to suspect. Sir Alistair was not content with mere business disagreements. She admitted, her voice steady but her hands betraying a slight tremor. "He possessed certain documents relating to my late husband's affairs. Nothing criminal, you understand, but matters that could be misinterpreted by hostile parties. He demanded not only control of the family trusts, but access to the Thornfield collection itself. The diamonds I wore last night were merely the beginning of his intended acquisitions." Mrs. Penelope Hartwell's confession proved even more damaging to the dead man's reputation. 20 years ago, before my marriage, Alistair and I were acquainted, she revealed, her composure finally cracking. "He kept letters from that period. Foolish, romantic nonsense that would destroy both my reputation and my daughter's prospects if made public. Last night he presented me with an ultimatum: persuade Margaret to accept his demands, or see those letters published in the scandal sheets." The pattern was becoming clear with crystalline precision. Sir Alistair had not been merely a successful businessman, but a systematic predator, using his wealth and influence to gather compromising information about Yorkshire's social elite. Each guest at the Christmas ball had been carefully selected not for their company, but for their vulnerability to his manipulations. It was near midnight when our investigation took a dramatic turn. Poirot and I were returning from a brief walk on the terrace. He had wanted to examine the snow patterns around the library's French doors, when we observed a faint glow emanating from the library windows. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered, his hand grasping my arm. Someone disturbs the scene of the crime. We approached with utmost caution, finding the library door unlocked and the long-dead fire hastily rekindled. A figure in dark clothing knelt before the hearth, feeding papers to the flames with desperate urgency. The light from the fire illuminated white, slender hands that spoke of refinement and careful grooming. The intruder, sensing our presence, spun toward the concealed servant's door that Poirot had discovered during his earlier exploration. But Poirot, with surprising agility for a man of his years, reached the bell pull and summoned assistance. Mr. Fellows appeared with remarkable promptness, and together we attempted to corner the mysterious figure, but they vanished into the maze of hidden passages that honeycombed the ancient house. From the dying flames, Poirot retrieved a partially burned document with the delicate precision of an archaeologist handling a precious artifact. The charred fragment bore tantalizing evidence. Draft, Mistletoe ball. Disp. And beneath it, in a different, firmer hand, 1140 tray. Noyau. Voila, Poirot breathed, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a hunter who has found the crucial track. The rehearsal, she had her script. Someone planned this murder with meticulous care, timing each element to the minute. The killer knew exactly when the tray would be delivered, exactly when Sir Alistair would be alone, exactly how to execute their plan while maintaining the perfect alibi. As we stood in the library, surrounded by the lingering scent of burned paper and the bitter memory of almonds, I realized that Poirot's investigation had reached its crucial turning point. The surface explanations had been stripped away, revealing the complex web of blackmail, desperation, and calculated revenge that lay beneath Thornfield Hall's respectable facade. "Tomorrow, mon ami," Poirot declared with quiet confidence, "we shall gather all the players for the final act. The little grey cells have absorbed much tonight, and now they begin to see the true architecture of this crime. The murderer walks among us still, confident in their clever misdirection, but they have made one crucial error. They have underestimated the persistence of Hercule Poirot's pursuit of justice." The investigation had moved beyond mere detection into the realm of psychological chess, where every move and counter-move brought us closer to the final, inevitable checkmate. The grey Yorkshire dawn brought little comfort to Thornfield Hall, where the shadows of the previous night's revelations seemed to cling to every corner like morning mist. Poirot had risen early, the charred document fragment positioned on his breakfast table where the pale winter light could illuminate every remaining character. The partially legible words, "Draft, Mistletoe ball, Disb," and the crucial notation 1140 tray, Noyau, had provided him with the architectural blueprint of the crime, but the identity of the architect remained tantalizingly beyond reach. "Mon ami," he murmured to me as I joined him, "let's observe how the criminal mind reveals itself through the very precision of its planning. This is not the desperate scrawl of sudden inspiration, but the careful notation of a methodical intelligence. Someone rehearsed this murder as thoroughly as a conductor prepares a symphony, timing each movement to achieve perfect harmony. He summoned Mrs. Bly, the housekeeper, whose practical competence and precise memory had already proven invaluable. The capable woman examined the fragment without touching it, her experienced eyes taking in every detail with professional assessment. "That handwriting is not from our household records, sir," she confirmed with certainty. "Our disbursement sheets are typed, not handwritten, and our headings are always spelled in full. This abbreviated style, DISB, suggests someone working from memory rather than official documentation." Poirot nodded with satisfaction. "Précisément, and the hand that wrote 1140 tray, Noyau, it is firm, decisive, accustomed to authority. Not the trembling script of fear, but the confident strokes of someone who believes their plan to be foolproof." The morning's investigation took an unexpected turn when Mr. Fellows approached, with obvious reluctance, carrying news that would reshape our understanding of the evening's events. During the formal examination of Sir Alistair's effects, a sealed envelope had been discovered in his inner coat pocket, overlooked in the initial confusion following the discovery of his body. The envelope's contents proved explosive. Inside was a brief note in Sir Alistair's distinctive handwriting. "The game ends tonight. Your secret dies with me, or Yorkshire learns the truth. The choice, as always, is yours. A.F." The paper bore no address, but the implications were clear. This was the final ultimatum in what had clearly been a prolonged campaign of psychological warfare. "Observe the psychology," Poirot said, examining the note with his magnifying glass. Sir Alistair was confident enough to put his threats in writing, yet vague enough to maintain deniability. The phrase, "as always," suggests this was not his first such communication. Our victim was conducting multiple campaigns of manipulation simultaneously. The revelation prompted Poirot to request a careful comparison of handwriting samples from all the guests. Lady Margaret provided examples of her correspondence. Dr. Thornfield offered pages from his medical notes, and even Sir Reginald, despite his obvious discomfort, submitted samples of his business correspondence. Mrs. Penelope Hartwell's elegant script, flowing and feminine, contrasted sharply with her daughter's more modern hand. It was during this examination that Poirot made a discovery that caused his eyes to sharpen with interest. Among Lady Margaret's papers was a place card from the previous evening's seating arrangement, written in her own hand for the high table. The script was firm and authoritative, with a particular way of forming the letter Y, and a distinctive dash that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the charred fragment. "Most illuminating," he murmured, though he shared his observation with no one but myself. "The handwriting, she tells us much, but we must be careful not to let her tell us too much too quickly. The little grey cells, they require all the evidence before rendering their verdict." The afternoon brought another significant development when Sir Reginald, his composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated guilt, requested a private interview. The proud industrialist's confession painted a picture of a man driven to desperate measures by systematic blackmail. "I went to the library that night," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not to harm Alistair, but to confront him one final time. I intended to tell him that I would not submit to his demands, regardless of the consequences to my reputation." His hands shook as he continued. "But when I arrived, he was already sitting in that chair, staring at nothing. I thought he was deliberately ignoring me, so I spoke to him, even touched his shoulder. It was only then I realized." Poirot leaned forward with intense interest. "You touched nothing else?" "I may have steadied myself against the table when the shock hit me. The realization that he was dead. It was overwhelming. I left immediately, too frightened to raise the alarm. A man in my position, discovered with a corpse." He shuddered. Who would have believed my innocence? This confession explained the mysterious smudges on the liqueur glasses that Poirot had noted, but it also raised new questions about the timeline of events. If Sir Reginald had found the body before Miss Evelyn's official discovery, then the murder had occurred even earlier than initially estimated. As the day progressed, Poirot observed the household with the intensity of a naturalist studying specimens in their native habitat. He noted Dr. Thornfield's increasing nervousness, particularly when the conversation turned to medical matters. The young physician's hands trembled slightly when handling his medical bag, and his usual professional confidence seemed to have deserted him entirely. "The psychology of guilt," Poirot observed to me privately, "manifests differently in different personalities. Some become aggressive, others withdrawn. Some seek to control the narrative, while others retreat into silence. But all reveal themselves through the accumulation of small betrayals, a trembling hand, an avoided glance, an answer that provides too much information or too little." The investigation had reached a crucial juncture. The physical evidence was largely assembled, The psychological profiles were emerging with increasing clarity, and the web of blackmail and desperation that had led to murder was becoming visible in all its complex ugliness. Yet Poirot maintained his characteristic patience, understanding that premature accusations could shatter the delicate psychological equilibrium he was so carefully constructing. "Tomorrow, mes amis," he announced to the assembled household as evening approached, "we shall gather once more in the library where this tragedy began. There, with the methodical precision that the little grey cells demand, we shall examine not only what happened on that fatal evening, but why it had to happen. The truth, I assure you, is more complex and more tragic than any of you have yet imagined." The words carried the weight of inevitability, and I observed how each person present received them according to their own conscience. The innocent appeared relieved that resolution was approaching, while others seemed to steel themselves for the final confrontation. The murderer walked among us still, but their carefully constructed deception was approaching its final act, and Hercule Poirot was preparing to ring down the curtain with characteristic dramatic flair. The investigation had moved beyond mere detection into the realm of psychological archaeology, where every buried secret and hidden motive would soon be excavated and exposed to the unforgiving light of justice. The grey Yorkshire dawn brought little comfort to Thornfield Hall, where the weight of accumulated secrets seemed to press down upon every inhabitant like the heavy winter clouds gathering outside. Poirot had risen early, his methodical nature demanding a final review of the evidence before the promised gathering. The charred document fragment lay before him on the morning room table, its partially legible words now forming part of a larger pattern that his little grey cells had been assembling with characteristic precision. "Mon ami," he said to me as I joined him for breakfast, "observe how the criminal mind reveals itself through the very thoroughness of its preparation. This fragment speaks not of sudden inspiration, but of methodical planning extending far beyond a single evening's work." His words proved prophetic when Mr. Fellows approached with obvious reluctance, carrying news that would illuminate the true scope of the conspiracy we had uncovered. During his routine inspection of the estate's administrative offices, the butler had discovered a small leather journal concealed beneath a loose floorboard in the records room, a location accessible only to those with intimate knowledge of the house's operation. The journal's contents were revelatory. Page after page documented Sir Alister's movements, habits, and preferences with the precision of a military reconnaissance report. Entries spanning several months revealed systematic surveillance. Tuesday, requests Noyau at 11:30, prefers library for private conversations. Thursday, retires early after confrontations. Saturday, always checks locks personally before retiring. The handwriting was firm and authoritative, matching perfectly the script we had observed on the charred fragment. Most damning was the final entry, dated the morning of the Christmas ball. "Tonight, Mistletoe ceremony provides perfect cover. Library tray at 11:40. Noyau preference confirmed, all elements positioned for final resolution." "Voilà," Poirot murmured with satisfaction, examining the journal through his magnifying glass. "Here we see the true architecture of this crime. Not the desperate act of sudden passion we were meant to believe, but the calculated execution of a plan months in the making. Someone with both access and authority has been studying Sir Alister like a scientist observing a laboratory specimen." The journal's hiding place was equally significant. The records room housed the estate's administrative files and was regularly accessed by only a select few: Lady Margaret herself, Mr. Fellows, and Dr. Thornfield in his capacity as heir and estate manager. The location suggested someone with legitimate reasons to be in that area, someone whose presence would arouse no suspicion. As we absorbed these revelations, Dr. Thornfield himself appeared in the morning room doorway, claiming to have just returned from a medical call to the village. His appearance was impeccable as always, but Poirot's sharp senses detected something that others might have missed, a faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds clinging to his clothing, despite the early hour and the supposed nature of his visit. "Doctor," Poirot said conversationally, "your patient in the village. I trust the emergency was not too serious." The young physician's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. "Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism, nothing that couldn't wait for proper daylight hours. The cold weather aggravates her condition severely." But his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and his usual professional confidence seemed forced, as though he were reciting lines rather than recounting genuine experience. It was then that Poirot made the connection that would prove crucial to his final deduction. During our earlier examination of Dr. Thornfield's surgery, he had noted with characteristic precision a small gap in the ordered row of hypodermic needles. The doctor had dismissed this as insignificant, claiming his inventory was complete, but Poirot's methodical mind had filed away this detail for future consideration. Now, coupled with the discovery of the minute puncture mark in the Noyau bottle and the evidence of systematic planning, the missing needle assumed sinister significance. The poison had not been poured into Sir Alister's glass. It had been injected directly into the bottle through that tiny hole, ensuring that whoever chose the Noyau would become the inevitable victim. "The method reveals the mind," Poirot observed quietly to me as Dr. Thornfield departed. "Only someone with medical training would think to use injection rather than mixture. Only someone with access to surgical instruments could execute such precision, and only someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's preferences could be certain of success." The morning's revelations had transformed our understanding of the crime from a crime of opportunity to one of meticulous premeditation. The murderer had spent months studying their victim, learning his habits, anticipating his choices, and preparing for the perfect moment to strike. The Christmas ball had provided not just opportunity, but the ideal cover for a plan that had been forming since the first threats of blackmail. As the household prepared for Poirot's promised gathering, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Lady Margaret maintained her dignified composure, but I observed the way her fingers worried at her throat where the Thornfield diamonds usually rested. Mrs. Penelope Hartwell sat with her daughter, their whispered conversations punctuated by anxious glances toward the library door. Sir Reginald, having unburdened himself of his secrets, appeared paradoxically more troubled than before, as though confession had brought not relief, but deeper anxiety about what other revelations might emerge. The psychological pressure was beginning to tell on everyone, but most particularly on the guilty party. Poirot had observed that guilt, like water, always finds a way to reveal itself, and the strain of maintaining innocence while surrounded by mounting evidence was becoming unbearable for someone in that room. "Tonight, mes amis," Poirot announced to the assembled company as evening approached, "we shall gather once more in the library where this tragedy began. There, with the methodical precision that justice demands, we shall examine not only what happened on that fatal evening, but why it had to happen exactly as it did. The truth, I assure you, is more complex and more tragic than any of you have yet imagined." His words carried the weight of inevitability, and I observed how each person present received them according to their own conscience. The innocent appeared relieved that resolution was approaching, while one individual seemed to steel themselves for what they knew would be the final confrontation. The carefully constructed deception that had been months in the planning was about to be unraveled by the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's extraordinary mind. As night fell over Thornfield Hall, I reflected that seldom had I witnessed a case where the psychology of the crime had been so methodically planned and so brilliantly concealed. The morning would bring justice, but it would also bring tragedy, for the truth that Poirot was preparing to reveal would shatter more than one life before the final curtain fell on this Christmas mystery. Morning arrived at Thornfield Hall with the brittle clarity that follows a night of accumulating revelations. Poirot had risen early, his methodical nature demanding one final verification before applying the psychological pressure that would bring this carefully constructed deception to its inevitable conclusion. He summoned Inspector Davies, who arrived with the resigned air of a man prepared to witness methods far beyond his usual experience. "Mon ami," Poirot explained as they prepared for what he termed a small scientific experiment. "The little grey cells have assembled the facts, but now we must test the psychology that lies beneath them. Truth, she has a way of revealing herself when subjected to the proper pressure." The morning room was arranged with characteristic precision, 3 small bottles positioned on a silver tray, each containing a different substance. Mr. Fellows had procured them at Poirot's specific request: rosewater from Lady Margaret's linen press, peppermint cordial from the pantry, and essence of bitter almonds from the pastry cook's supplies. The arrangement appeared innocent enough, but I recognized the gleam in Poirot's eyes that indicated his trap was carefully baited. Each guest was summoned individually and asked to identify the contents of the bottles by scent alone, their eyes politely averted from any identifying labels. The exercise seemed almost whimsical, yet I observed how Poirot noted every reaction with scientific precision. Lady Margaret approached the task with characteristic composure, identifying each scent correctly without hesitation. Rosewater, peppermint, and bitter almonds. "The cook uses it for her Christmas biscuits," she stated matter-of-factly. Sir Reginald, despite his obvious nervousness, managed to name the first 2 correctly and described the third as something like almond cakes. Mrs. Penelope Hartwell demonstrated the refined sensibilities of a woman long accustomed to managing household supplies, identifying all 3 with confident precision. It was when Dr. Thornfield stepped forward that the atmosphere in the room underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. He approached the bottles with his usual professional bearing, naming the rosewater immediately and pausing only briefly at the peppermint. But when presented with the essence of bitter almonds, his reaction was telling. He inhaled carefully, frowned with concentration, then stepped back with obvious uncertainty. "I'm afraid I cannot detect any particular scent from the 3rd bottle," he admitted, his voice carrying just a note of forced casualness. "Perhaps the cold has affected my senses." Poirot's response was delivered with deceptive mildness. But of course, Doctor. Not everyone possesses the genetic ability to detect that particular odor. It is, as you say, a matter of heredity." He paused, allowing the words to settle before continuing with surgical precision. "Most curious, then, that last night you were so swift and certain in identifying cyanide poisoning by its characteristic bitter almond scent." The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Thornfield's medical composure, so carefully maintained throughout the investigation, showed its first visible crack. His hands, usually steady from years of surgical training, betrayed a slight tremor as he attempted to formulate a response. The facial coloration and the rapidity of death provided clear indicators, he said, his voice perhaps a fraction too controlled. Combined with the circumstances, the diagnosis was relatively straightforward. But Poirot was far from finished with his psychological dissection. From his coat pocket, he produced the leather journal discovered in the records room, handling it with the reverence of an archaeologist examining a precious artifact. "This document, mes amis, reveals the true scope of our murderer's preparation," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Observe the meticulous nature of these entries. Months of surveillance, careful notation of habits and preferences, systematic study of the victim's every movement. This is not the desperate scrawl of sudden inspiration, but the methodical documentation of a mind that approached murder as a complex problem requiring systematic solution." He opened the journal to reveal pages of careful handwriting, each entry dated and precisely recorded. The assembled company leaned forward despite themselves, drawn by the horrible fascination of witnessing such calculated malice laid bare. "Tuesday. Requests Noyau at 11:30. Prefers library for private conversations." Poirot read aloud, his voice carrying each word with deliberate emphasis. Thursday, retires early after confrontations. Saturday, always checks locks personally before retiring. And finally, dated the morning of the Christmas ball. Tonight, mistletoe ceremony provides perfect cover. Library tray at 11:40. Noyau preference confirmed. All elements positioned for final resolution. The psychological pressure in the room was now almost tangible. Dr. Thornfield had grown increasingly pale, yet his professional training allowed him to maintain a facade of clinical detachment, even as the evidence mounted against him. The handwriting, Poirot continued inexorably, shows remarkable similarity to administrative documents from this estate. Someone with legitimate access to the records room. Someone whose presence there would arouse no suspicion. Someone with both the authority and the knowledge to compile such detailed intelligence. It was then that the morning's most dramatic moment arrived. A commotion from the corridor announced that young Whitmore, driven to desperation by his imprisonment, had attempted to escape through his bedroom window. Only the treacherous ice on the drain pipe had prevented what might have been a fatal fall. He was brought to the library, shivering and defiant, his attempted flight having only deepened the suspicions against him. Poirot regarded the young man with characteristic compassion. "Do not fear, mon ami," he said gently. "The trap was laid for you with considerable skill, but it was not of your making. Someone wished very much for you to appear guilty, and they nearly succeeded." Then, in a voice pitched to carry beyond the immediate audience, he added with calculated precision, "The missing hypodermic needle has been located, and upon it we have found traces of a particular oil used by only one person in this house." The effect was immediate and devastating. From somewhere in the corridor came the sound of a chair falling, followed by the sharp click of a door closing too quickly. When we investigated, we discovered Dr. Thornfield at the surgery wash basin, his sleeves rolled up, scrubbing his hands with a ferocity that spoke more eloquently than any confession. "That will suffice, Doctor," Poirot said quietly, his voice carrying infinite gentleness despite the terrible accusation implicit in his words. "Water cannot cleanse what lies upon the conscience. This afternoon we shall gather once more in the library where this tragedy began. You will attend, and you will listen, and when the proper moment arrives, you will speak the truth that your actions have already revealed." As we prepared for the final confrontation, I reflected upon the masterful way Poirot had applied psychological pressure without resorting to dramatic accusations or premature revelations. The guilty party had been systematically isolated, their carefully constructed deception unraveled thread by thread, until the weight of accumulated evidence made denial impossible. The little gray cells had done their work with characteristic precision, and now only the formal revelation remained. The psychological game was complete, and Dr. Marcus Thornfield, despite his medical training and careful planning, had been outmaneuvered by the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's extraordinary mind. The truth would soon be spoken aloud, but in the deepest sense it had already been revealed through the inexorable process of scientific deduction applied to the complex psychology of human desperation and guilt. The library at Thornfield Hall had been arranged with ceremonial precision for Poirot's final revelation. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the fading winter light, and the fire crackled with renewed vigor, casting dancing shadows across the assembled company. Sir Alister's empty armchair stood opposite the hearth like a silent witness, while the drinks tray remained positioned exactly as it had been on that fatal evening. Lady Margaret sat with regal composure despite her obvious strain, while Mrs. Penelope Hartwell clutched her daughter's trembling hand. Sir Reginald stared into the middle distance with grim resignation, and young Whitmore, escorted by a constable and still bearing the marks of his failed escape attempt, looked battered but hopeful. Dr. Marcus Thornfield stood apart near the bookshelves, his medical composure maintained through sheer force of will, though his hands betrayed him with their subtle trembling. Poirot positioned himself beside the fireplace, his small figure commanding absolute attention through the quiet authority of his presence. Inspector Davies stood ready with his notebook, while I took my customary position to observe both detective and audience. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "we gather to examine not merely a murder, but a masterpiece of deception requiring months of preparation and a mind capable of thinking several moves ahead. The crime was planned with military precision and executed with surgical skill." He gestured toward the drinks tray. The method was ingenious in its simplicity. Our murderer knew Sir Alister's preference for noyau and the exact timing of the butler's delivery. But the poison was not added to the glass. No, that would have been too crude. Instead, it was injected directly into the bottle through a microscopic puncture, invisible to casual observation, but detectable to those who know where to look. Producing the leather journal, he continued with relentless logic. "This document reveals months of systematic surveillance. Tuesday, requests noyau at 11:30. Thursday, retires early after confrontations. And finally, tonight, mistletoe ceremony provides perfect cover. Library tray at 11:40. Noyau preference confirmed." The handwriting shows remarkable similarity to estate administrative documents, someone with legitimate access, whose presence would arouse no suspicion. He turned his penetrating gaze toward Dr. Thornfield. The scapegoat was prepared with equal care. A duplicate club scarf planted in Monsieur Whitmore's luggage, photographic chemicals to suggest means, and careful orchestration of witness testimony. Yet the witness who saw the gentleman with the striped scarf also observed a tie-pin bearing hammer and anvil, Sir Reginald's crest. She spoke truth, but the wrong man was meant to hang for it. The psychological pressure in the room was now almost tangible. Dr. Thornfield had grown increasingly pale, yet his professional training allowed him to maintain his facade even as the evidence mounted inexorably. "But the crucial error," Poirot continued with surgical precision, "was your swift identification of cyanide poisoning by its bitter almond scent. Yet this morning, when presented with pure essence of bitter almonds, you professed to smell nothing. You do not possess the genetic faculty to detect that odor. You knew the poison because you had delivered it, and you spoke of a scent you have never truly perceived to hurry the investigation toward your prepared solution." The silence stretched unbearably until Dr. Thornfield's professional composure finally cracked completely. His shoulders sagged under the weight of exposed guilt, and when he spoke, his voice carried months of accumulated desperation. "He possessed medical records from my student days," he confessed, the words pouring out with the force of a dam bursting. "A patient who died under my care due to what appeared to be negligence. The death was ruled accidental, but Sir Alister threatened to present these documents to the medical board unless I convinced Lady Margaret to submit to his blackmail regarding the family trusts and the Thornfield collection." His voice grew stronger, almost defiant. I had worked years to establish my practice, to prove myself worthy of the Thornfield name. He would have destroyed not only my career, but dragged my aunt through public disgrace. I studied his habits for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The Christmas ball provided ideal cover, a house full of suspects, complex social dynamics where anyone might have motive. Lady Margaret's composure finally cracked. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My dear boy, what have you done?" As Inspector Davies stepped forward to make the arrest, Dr. Thornfield straightened with renewed dignity. "I regret the deception, but not the deed itself. Sir Alister was a predator who destroyed lives for profit. I chose the cleanest method I knew. He never suffered, never knew what was happening." "And Monsieur Whitmore?" Poirot asked quietly. "I needed the police to accept a quick solution before they examined the evidence too closely. I found his chemicals, planted the scarf. Everyone had seen him quarrel with Sir Alister. I misjudged only the scent test. Medical texts always mention the bitter almond odor, so I claimed to detect what I never could." As the young physician was led away, his medical career and family honor destroyed by the very desperation that had driven him to murder, Poirot observed the tragic scene with characteristic compassion. This case illustrates the terrible price of allowing systematic evil to flourish unchecked, he reflected sadly. Sir Alister's predatory blackmail created the very desperation that led to his death. In the deepest sense, he was both victim and architect of his own destruction. The psychological game was complete. Justice served, but the scars revealed would take far longer to heal than the mere solving of the mystery itself. The hours after Dr. Marcus Thornfield's confession settled over Thornfield Hall with a hush as profound as snowfall on the Yorkshire moors. The relentless tension that had gripped the household gave way to a heavy quiet, as if the house itself was pausing to absorb the consequences of truth finally spoken. Inspector Davies, with a gravity that belied any sense of triumph, led Dr. Thornfield away. The young physician maintained a strange dignity, his resignation not defeat, but the weary acceptance of a man who had played out every desperate possibility and found none led to peace. Poirot, ever attuned to the needs of the living as well as the claims of justice, suggested the household gather in the drawing-room for tea. The familiar ritual, china clinking, steam rising, provided a balm to nerves frayed by suspicion and grief. Lady Margaret, her composure at last unguarded, sat quietly among her guests, the Thornfield diamonds at her throat, now somber reminders of the cost of pride and secrecy. Mrs. Penelope Hartwell and her daughter Evelyn found solace in each other's company, while Sir Reginald, shoulders bowed, lingered by the window, lost in thought. Young Whitmore, newly freed from suspicion, yet marked by his ordeal, approached Poirot with a mixture of gratitude and shame. Poirot offered him a gentle, practical admonition. "To run, monsieur, that is to be human. But let it be a lesson. Honesty, though sometimes costly, is the surest path. The little grey cells, they have rescued you, but you must now rescue yourself from old habits." Inspector Davies, privately, expressed his thanks to Poirot. "Without your patience, I would have condemned an innocent man. My methods, too tidy for a mind as clever as our murderer's." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "You kept order, Inspector. Without order, truth may not be found. But sometimes, you see, it is the order itself that is the killer's tool." A systematic search of Sir Alister's effects, now undertaken with understanding rather than haste, yielded a locked attaché case. Within was the evidence of a career built on manipulation, letters, photographs, damaging agreements, and a ledger of names, testaments to the breadth of his predations. Inspector Davies, his jaw set, promised careful handling. Some items, the letters Mrs. Hartwell so feared, were sealed, their contents to be seen by no one but the law, if ever. Poirot reassured her. "Madame, you have suffered enough. Let justice be tempered with mercy." Sir Reginald, having unburdened his secrets to Poirot and the household, declared his intention to make a full statement to his board and accept whatever consequences the truth might bring. The resolve in his voice, less bluster, more humility, hinted at the possibility of redemption. Lady Margaret, in a gesture of quiet leadership, announced plans to create a fund for those harmed by Sir Alister's blackmail, the first step in restoring what could be restored. It was not penance, she said, but duty, one she undertook for those who had suffered in silence. As the inquest drew near, its proceedings were brief. The combination of Dr. Thornfield's confession and the weight of evidence left little to debate. Dr. Thornfield, now facing trial, composed a final letter to his aunt. Lady Margaret read it in private, and whatever pain it caused was matched by a measure of solace, for she emerged from her study with a steadier gaze. On the morning of our departure, Poirot and I walked the frost-silvered grounds. Mr. Fellows supervised the careful removal of the mistletoe, and the last of the holiday garlands drooped along the terrace. The house, like its people, was beginning the slow work of recovery. As our car waited, Poirot lingered by the drive, his gaze lingering on the ancient stones of Thornfield Hall. "Hastings," he said, "so often the murderer is no monster, but a soul driven to the edge by another's cruelty. Sir Alistair, he sowed the seeds of his own destruction. Dr. Thornfield, in seeking to cut out a cancer, became, tragically, the very thing he most feared." "And the law, Poirot?" I asked quietly. "The law deals with deeds, mon ami, not with the sorrow that breeds them, but it is for us, the living, to repair what we can and remember the rest. There is a justice of the courts, and there is the justice of the heart." He adjusted his scarf, moustaches immaculate even in the Yorkshire cold, and offered a final wry smile. "You English, your mistletoe leads to adventure. I, Hercule Poirot, prefer my Christmas with a little more order and a little less poison." We drove away, leaving behind a house changed by tragedy, but not destroyed. The snow, falling once more, softened every harsh edge, hinting at the possibility of renewal. Justice, imperfect, human, and hard-won, had been done. In the quiet aftermath, the lessons of the mistletoe ball would linger, that beneath the surface of order can lie the seeds of chaos, that the pain caused by one man's evil can ripple outward in ways no one intends, and that, as always, the greatest mysteries are those of the human heart.